So, part three of Unit 4 is going to deal with the gigantic bucket of whack that is World War One. And before we jump into America's role in it, we're going to spend a few days looking at how the war develops and progresses, as well as examine why it was that America was late in coming to the war. So, to begin with, let's look at Europe in 1914. The Europe of 1914 is very different than the Europe of the 21st century. For example, Germany is just enormous. France is actually smaller than it was. There is no Ireland. There's no Finland. Norway and Sweden are different sized. There's no Poland. There's no Ukraine. There's no odd, like, stand countries. Turkey is this gigantic thing down here. It's very different. In 1914, Europe essentially was made up of a variety of empires and kingdoms. And these empires and kingdoms formed themselves into two gigantic alliance systems. In 1907, the Kingdom of the Empire of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, the Republic, Empire of the Republic of France, and the Russian Empire joined together to form the Triple Entente, a counterbalance to the alliance of the Empire of Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Empire of the Kingdom of Italy, forming the Triple Alliance. So these countries and their alliances were part of a political theory known as balance of power. The idea that if every country in Europe was more or less equal and they were all sort of balanced out, that nobody would go to war with each other because there was really no sure way of winning. And to the credit of the guys who came up with this idea, it worked for almost 100 years. The only real major conflict between 1815 and 1914 was the rather obscure Crimean War, where England and France allied with the Ottoman Empire against Russia, and it really wasn't a very big thing. You have some small regional wars like the Austro Prussian War and the Franco Prussian War, but those are over in a couple of months, and they really don't involve anything more than regional areas going at each other. So, at least in theory, this idea of balance of power worked quite well. But not unlike the giant volcano underneath Yellowstone Park, there are long simmering and festering issues that are gnawing away at these two alliance systems. Give me a second here. So, underneath the surface, you have a long standing rivalry between France and Germany. Germany existed as a country because in 1871, the northern German province, state, whatever you want to call it, Principality of Prussia, defeated France in a war. And that defeat of the French united all of the German states together as one country, highlighted with the German emperor being crowned in the French Palace of Versailles. Both sides desperately wanted to go back to war with each other. For the French, it was revenge and the opportunity to take back territory it had lost in the war and to prove to Germany that the French were not to be taken lightly. For the Germans, it was we beat the French up once, let's beat them up again. There is the growing problem of the German English naval arms race, where the two countries are spending enormous amounts of money in an effort to build up the most powerful navy in Europe. Now, this is really a no contest. The English easily are going to win this one, but what it does result in is the Germans investing an enormous amount of money in building submarines, which the English do not really have. Then there's the issue of Germany and Russia. Are you noticing a pattern here, by the way? Um, Germany really just wants to humiliate Russia. In in the early 20th century, Russia was not only the largest country in the world, it had the world's largest army, basically. The Germans had the best army and the most technologically advanced, and they wanted to prove to Russia that they could beat the snot out of them in a war. And basically, that's really all that it is. Then, last but certainly not least, is the rivalry between Russia and Austria over control of the Balkan Peninsula. The Balkan Peninsula is a more or less useless area. I know it's going to bother some people in this part of Europe, southeastern Europe. Um, Russia is right up here. The Austro Hungarian Empire is right here. Up until the early 20th century, this whole area had belonged to the Ottoman Empire. But beginning with Greece, these countries one by one became independent of the Ottomans, and then they started fighting each other. The Austrians looked at the fighting as a means to grab a hold of territory. The Russians saw it as their duty to protect the people in here because they were, for the most part, Orthodox Christians and ethnically related to the Russians. So these are the four sets of underlying criteria or underlying problems that are there in Europe while all the peace and hippie love stuff is going on. Now, in order to fully understand the the causes of the war, a really simple, quick way to look at the start of the war is by using the acronym MAIN. MAIN. The main causes of the war are militarism, alliance systems, imperialism, and nationalism. MAIN. So, militarism. By the early 20th century, Europe was spending enormous amounts of money on building the most modern, best army available. Money was being spent particularly by the Germans in trying to develop a navy to rival England's as well. And militarily, almost every country in Europe had mandatory conscription. That meant that when you were a man and you turned 18, or boy, as the case may be, and you turned 18, you automatically went into the army. So these literally were countries that had citizen armies that, like, everybody was trained to fight. The alliance system. We already looked at the complex alliance system with not only are they sort of like politically allied, there's a blood alliance here as well, in that most of the people that we are talking about here are family. Here is a picture of Queen Victoria of England, her 9 children, and many of her 42 grandchildren. By European custom and essentially um, royal decree, royalty had to marry royalty. And as a result of this, The royal families of England, Germany, Norway, Spain, Russia, Sweden, Greece, Romania, Denmark, and a bunch of other small, dinky states and provinces around Europe were all first and second cousins. They all intermarried to maintain the purity of the imperial bloodlines. So this meant that not only did you have an alliance politically, you had a family alliance with all of these people. And many of these alliances were set up with secret agreements that nobody really understood exactly what they were getting into. Imperialism, the great game to build the world's biggest or wealthiest empire. There's a couple of different ways to approach imperialism. You can do it in terms of trying to find the most valuable things out there for trade or for resource acquisitions. That's kind of the way the British did it. Or you can kind of do what the French did, which is just grab up giant chunks of land so it looks super impressive on a map. The French controlled literally like a third of Africa by themselves. The problem was as much of that third of Africa was the Sahara Desert, and that really was meaningless, but that's okay. It looked really impressive on a map. Nationalism. So not only were these countries trying to compete against each other to build the biggest military and to build the biggest and best empire, they genuinely believed that their countries were superior to anybody else, not for any reason other than the fact that they were citizens of the greatest nation in Europe. So if you were a German or you were a colonial in an area controlled by Germany, German East Africa or Trinidad and Tobago in the Pacific, um, you were proud because you were German. The same way that, like, the Indians were proud that they were members of the British Empire and members of the British Commonwealth. This belief fed into rivalry as well, and the desire to prove superiority over other countries. So, this is why Maine, MAIN, is a good way to remember the four long term causes of the war: the development and buildup of the military, the complex alliance systems, the role of imperialism and the competition of imperialism, and the role of nationalism and the belief in the superiority of your country and the desire to prove your superiority. Now, the spark that starts World War One. So, in the early 20th century, we've already kind of mentioned that the Balkan Peninsula started to break away and become independent of the Ottoman Empire, starting with Greece. These countries slowly formed their own separate states. You have like Albania and I think this is Albania. There's Romania and Montenegro is somewhere in here. Croatia is somewhere in here. Serbia, obviously. Bosnia Herzegovina, Bulgaria. These countries started fighting with each other in an effort to assert control and domination over the peninsula. While they were busy fighting each other, Austria, which is this big hunkin' thing here, Austria slowly moved in and randomly took over this little dinky chunk of land, Bosnia Herzegovina. Seemingly, really nobody cares. It's just a small dinky piece of land. So, what's the big issue? The big issue is that this country right here, Serbia, doesn't like that. Because what Serbia wants is to combine this whole region into a sort of gigantic Slavic country where Serbia will rule over everybody because ethnically they're all more or less the same. Now, this idea of this like giant Slavic Serbia or Serbia Slavic country is backed up by these bad boys up here. They are okay with it. So in 1913 or thereabouts, when